Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Imogen Crimp in conversation this evening with Addie Woolridge in support of Imogen's debut novel, Very Nice Girl. Just a quick webinar overview for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed this evening, but you can keep the chat window open as I will be sharing links to purchase the novel from Literati throughout the event. Q&A is also accessible to you, so please feel free if you're watching us live to submit questions at any time. I will read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation. And live transcription is available to you using the CC icon on your toolbar as well. And of course, if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books directly in the description below me. You can also like and subscribe to be kept up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events when they become available on our channel. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd like to thank you for your attendance this afternoon or earlier this afternoon in Addie's case, or practically tomorrow in Imogen's case, wherever or whenever you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Imogen Crimp studied English at Cambridge, followed by an MA in Contemporary Literature from University College London, where she specialized in female modernist writers. After university, she briefly studied singing at London Conservatory. She lives in London. Joining her, born and raised outside Seattle, Washington, Addie Woolridge is a classically trained opera singer with a degree in music from the University of Southern California, and she holds a master's degree in public administration from Indiana University. Woolridge's well-developed character is a result of her love for diverse people, cultures, and experiences. She currently lives in Northern California. She isn't writing or singing. Woolridge can be found baking, training for her 6th race in the 7 Continents Marathon Challenge, or taking advantage of the region's signature beverage, wine. Please join me in welcoming Imogen Crimp and Addie Woolridge into your living rooms.
Thanks, John. I feel like I should be honest and say that I have a glass of wine right now, even though it is nowhere near 5 o'clock. So I'm just going to be upfront about that right now. You may or may not see me drinking it. Imogen, thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation with you. When I got the arc of your debut, I remember thinking, this person has absolutely nailed the intricate workings of opera and what it means to be an opera singer, like the boring kind of nitty gritty, and then the big exciting bits and pieces. So I kind of want to start a little bit with your background as a singer and a writer and how that sort of influenced your work.
Yeah, so I started singing when I was quite young, and I'd actually came to it after. So I was a violinist first. I started singing when I was a teenager, and I did a lot of choral singing at university. But I didn't really get into opera until later, and I did like a year at conservatoire after university. Yeah, after that, I started writing basically. So originally, I had this idea that I was going to be an opera singer. And in terms of like how singing has influenced my writing, I think it has, I suppose, in a number of ways. I guess something about opera singing particularly is that, of course, you work with text and story. And that was something I always found that really drew me to that aspect of singing, the text. In terms of like how that's influenced my writing and my creative process, I think one thing is that I have this very kind of scenes-based way of seeing writing. So I think if you're kind of used to working with stage work and used to working with singing, rather than thinking of things as being very kind of internal, I guess you think of things as dramas played out between people and as dialogue. And that's something that I've always been really, really interested in. So making work that feels kind of immediate and like where we're in the middle of the action. So I think that's one way that it's influenced my writing. I think perhaps another way is just a general interest in like words and language that I think you really develop through studying singing. So something I always do when I'm writing is that I read everything out loud and like listen to the sounds and the rhythms of it. And I think that definitely comes from this like interest in and love of music. What about you? I'd love to know how your kind of background in music, how you feel that's fed into your writing.
I was laughing and kind of smiling along because it's like, oh, I recognize this. It probably should have been a hint to me when I was in music school and we had rep or lit classes essentially. And I would write these long papers creating backstories for operas that weren't on the page. And in hindsight, like, girl, you wanted to be a writer. Like, what were you doing there? Like intricately researched backstories. So I think that kind of fits. I started singing when I was pretty little. I have a reading disability. So my parents didn't want me to feel like I couldn't do something. They wanted me to feel special. And so they signed me up for a music class because my second grade music teacher, Sandy Anderson, said that I could carry a tune. Shout out to educators. If any of you are educators, thank you. And it turned out I was pretty good at it. And I sung competitively all through my childhood doing, all of those, I'm sure you have them. Yeah, those like little almost baby ballroom. You're like in a ball gown, but you're 14 kind of competitions. I went to college, did the same thing, and I graduated during a recession. And the only place that was hiring were like cruise ships. And I desperately did not want to get on a cruise ship. So that made me kind of pivot. But how it influences my writing, I think there are a couple different ways that I would assume, and as you know, the work of being a musician is deeply unglamorous. Like there's nothing sexy about the kind of like grind of singing the same thing 12 times over.
Yeah, that's not how people see it at all.
No. Like the finished product that people see is this like beautiful, complex, and in reality, you sang the same phrase for an hour and a half straight. I think that prepared me to write more than anything. It's just that kind of butt in the chair, do the work.
No, absolutely. And I think that there's, when you're a musician, the skill that you really learn is that diligence of practice and the diligence of, you don't stop until it's perfect, until you've totally polished it. And I think that that definitely feeds into my writing. I don't know the extent to which that's helpful. But I'd say certainly I'm a massive perfectionist. I'm sort of still in the practice room when I'm writing.
Very much is. It kind of prepares you to be alone too, hearing the same thing over and over again. I don't know about you in the practice rooms, but that soundproof room where you're just sort of alone with your thoughts slowly spiraling, like, am I good enough? Woo!
Yeah, and to do sort of the kind of positive self-talk that you need, like going and to push through that, because writing a novel is, it's such a long task. It takes such a long time. You need so much discipline, determination to push through it. And I think that music really teaches you how to do that.
Oh, absolutely. And I also use a screen reader, so I don't just read it myself. I let a very boring computer read it to me. Because if the emotion, like if I think there's a built-in program for Word, but you can also do like browser extensions, that sort of thing. If the emotion isn't there, when a boring computer voice reads it to you, then it just isn't there, period. Like otherwise it's me reading the line with the intonation that I need, as opposed to letting the words do the work for me. Here's another perfectionist tip that you can just add that into the process.
need to put that into my work. Yeah, I was interested that you said that when you were learning roles, you did all these kind of big creative backstories for characters. And I think it was definitely the same for me. I really started to realize while I was singing that I felt quite sort of hampered by the fact that the role and the story had always been determined for me. And I really wanted to create my own stories. And I found that there was actually not as much freedom within the operatic world as I wanted to do that, and that I maybe the stories in those operas maybe didn't actually appeal to me so much as writing my own stories. Or I was wondering like what you think about that, because you still sing opera. Do you still like, how do you how do you kind of relate to it in terms of like the stories? What do you think about operatic stories?
Oh gosh, I think there was a time where I kind of needed to step away and give myself some space. And what I realized is that as writing kind of became my job, music became more fun again. If that makes sense. The act of creating and because of the stuff that I write romance, right? And you have got to follow a couple rules. If you deviate from the rules, do not kill a pet. It needs to end happily. If anybody out here is not a romance writer, those are like the two big rules. The titles are promises. I actually got an upset letter from a reader because there weren't enough checklists in the checklist. And romance titles mean something. So this person picked up a book thinking they were going to get some lists. And I think, who really wants to read my to-do list? So I didn't include enough of them, and they felt strongly the other way. And they let me know. But I think as this kind of became my job, I realized that there was a little bit more creativity in that space than I had initially recognized, but I also needed to step away from it and kind of grow up. And I think that much like writing, the way you think about opera changes as you age, and the way you think about storytelling changes as you age. Mm-hmm. And I think something that resonates with me with your work, and that does kind of tie to the way that I think about opera, and in a lot of cases, romance writing too, is a moment in time in the way that a story is told. And I think when I was young, the like little feminist in me couldn't make peace with some of the stuff that I was reading, where I was like, why do we keep telling these stories that are like, ugh, yuck, yuck, yuck. Like, man, we're doing this one again, huh? Madam Butterfly. That's not terrible in every way.
Yeah,
like literally, can we please just never, ever do this show again, right? But it's in every house. Every rep does it every couple of years, you know? And until I was a little bit older, I couldn't really place and time things in a way that let me give the writers a little bit of grace and give myself as a performer a little bit of grace. And I'm curious now, you've stopped performing. Am I remembering that right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And why did you kind of walk away? How did you decide, like, you know, we're good here, I can go?
I think that the honest truth is that I probably discovered or decided, realized that I wasn't good enough to have the sort of career that I wanted to have. But I think that also came hand in hand with like really falling out of love with that world. I think that was for a number of reasons. I think that one of them was that I found the kind of intensely competitive nature of singing really exhausting. And I also felt that it didn't really suit my personality in a way that I think writing does. I mean, I found the kind of, in some ways I loved those like highs of performance, the adrenaline, the fact that like all of it turns on this kind of one moment that can go horribly wrong or like can be wonderful, and like every single night that's different, and you never like, it's just totally, it feels unpredictable. In some ways I loved that, and in other ways I found the highs and lows kind of crushing and exhausting. So I think it was partly that. I mean, writing the sort of privacy aspect of writing, kind of being able to hide behind character and words, but still express myself, I think suits my personality a lot better. So I think, you know, that was one side of it. And then the other was the fact that I started feeling quite kind of hampered by like the restrictions of those stories in the operatic world. But I mean, I think that was probably also largely to do with me not like engaging with it in the right way, or not kind of being able to use my voice as well as like other brilliant singers can. Because like I do think that opera is relevant, and I think that's something that I really tried to get across in my book. So my character, she's a young woman, she's learning to be an opera singer, but she's also, you know, she's living in London, she's having, in contemporary London, she is in this complicated relationship with an older, wealthy man, and she's also like living in sort of squalid London, like studenty lifestyle. And something that I found kind of interesting that I tried to draw out in the novel was the fact that so many of the themes in my book, or the things that my character was living, are things that are all there in these operas. So the two operas that my character Anna performs are Manon and Bohème, and both of these operas, they're about young women who are living in kind of precarious situations, and who essentially have to kind of decide between art or in the case of Bohème, like these kind of bohemian lifestyles, or love in the case of Manon, and like wealth, or being with somebody richer, being supported. So while for me, I personally felt kind of restricted by that world, that's not to say that I think it necessarily has to be like that. I think that was, a lot about my attitude and kind of me gradually becoming disillusioned by it, rather than something that's necessarily like entrenched in the art form. And I think that's something that was kind of important to me in writing about opera. Like the kind of way that I found to write about it in the novel was, rather than thinking about it, it's interesting that you talk about time and like positioning it in time, because like I suppose for me, rather than trying to position those stories in their kind of historical context, what I did instead was I tried to kind of imbue them with like modern resonance. So like in those parts of my book where Anna is performing those operas, like rather than describing what's happening on stage, I have sort of put it's in the first person. I've had her kind of inhabit the world of the character, but also but in a way that describes the sort of psychological beats of the narrative. So the kind of the way that those stories could actually or might actually be relevant to somebody now and to somebody's life now. So yeah, I think I decided to step away from opera. It wasn't for me, but but I'm still very fond of it. How did you get into writing from opera?
Oh gosh, this is a somewhat embarrassing story. So I was like, so I was living in LA, and I had some friends who I just thought were the coolest people. And this speaks volumes to what my idea of cool was. One of them has a PhD in folklore, and the other, like folklore, like, fairy tales and things like that. Yeah, right. So you're going to be a professor with that kind of degree. And then another had, she was an artist architect, so building large scale art installations that you see in parks and things like that. But they were both aspiring writers. And I had taken a day job, and I was like a strong writer. So I was ghostwriting essentially a rich man's letters, which was hilarious because he was like a 60-year-old father of 4 and a deeply conservative man. And I'm definitely a young Black woman with no children. So sometimes I used to come up with just absolutely ridiculous phrases and see if I could sneak them in there. Anyway, they had approached me about starting a writers group. And I had said, I don't really write fiction, but I love reading and I'm happy to join. I write nonfiction for my job. And one of the women was like, oh, that's fine. That's totally cool. So for 4 months, I went to someone else's writers group and I just read their fiction and I like gave them little notes. I was like, this is so much fun. I'm having the best time. And then about 4 months in, this woman turns to me and she's like, Addie, we never get to your pages. We never get to your pages. We're going to start with you next time.
Like, I don't have any pages.
there are no pages to have, right? And in that moment, I realized that she forgot that I don't write fiction. And more or less, I was like pretending to belong somewhere that I didn't. So I called my little sister, who was getting her master's degree in editing at the time. And I was like, Coco, what do I do? She was like, well, girl, I think the best thing you can do is ghost them. You should just never talk to these people ever again, because you don't write. You're screwed. It's like, but they're my friends and they're cool. So I called my mom, and my mom was like, wait, Ed, it's 10 pages, right? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, they don't have to be good, do they? I was like, no, they just have to be 10 pages of something. And she was like, well, do you think you could write 10? I was like, sure, I think I could write 10 pages of something, right? Again, that elaborate backstory from creating characters in opera. So I sat down, and when nobody tells you like the first 10 pages are the easiest. So I sat down and I wrote the first 10 pages in like a couple hours. And I was like, this is so fun. I'm having fun. And I sent it to my sister. who never read it. I brought it to, she never read it. I brought it to the group and they were like, this is really good. You should finish writing it. And I thought, I'll write the next 10 pages the next time I get called out. But about a month later, my sister did open the email that I sent her. And she's like, yeah, this is actually good. Maybe you should finish writing this. And I was like, oh, thanks. And so I did. And that turned into my first book. But I literally got here because I'm a big liar.
Oh, wow. That is a great story. And did the first 10 pages stay in the book?
Oddly enough, I tend to write pretty hard, good openings. And then the rest of the book is like, I don't know what you're doing over here, girl. You got to clean that up. But my first 10 pages tend to stay in my novels. After that, it's a crapshoot. First 10, hang in there. I'm curious. So you had mentioned moving these operas into kind of the first person. Is that how you experienced opera when you were thinking about character? Or was opera kind of always outside of yourself as you were working on a character?
You mean when I was singing myself?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that always was how I experienced it. I mean, I remember, so my first instrument was the violin. And I remember when I was learning violin music, I used to kind of like your backstories. I used to come up with quite elaborate ideas of what was happening in a piece and pin it to narrative. And I always found that by inhabiting the story of something, my perceived story of something, even when there weren't words, that was how it kind of meant something emotionally to me. And I definitely used to do the same thing with singing music. So I rather than sort of pretending that I was the character, I would, and imagining what it would be like to inhabit that time period and whatever, I would try and think about times in my life when I'd felt similar way to the times in that music, pin arias or characters to particular moments in my life or psychology that I understood, because I'm not very good at acting, but I feel that is the way that you make it real and relevant. And if you're pretending, then you're always just pretending, you're always just acting, and that's doesn't feel authentic to me, I suppose. I think the other reason I did it was I experimented with other ways of writing those parts of the novel. And it was really important to me that the performing elements of the novel, because they're so key to my character, because the novel is about, a young woman kind of coming into herself both as a woman, but also as a musician, as a performer. So it was really important to me to write those performing scenes in a way that felt authentic and real. And I tried some other ways. I tried writing them sort of much more technically than I ended up writing them as, going through the nuts and bolts of singing a bit more, and how support felt and how it felt to hold breath and whatever. And as you can imagine, that was really dull. And then I also tried to do it in the third person as well. So the whole novel's in the first person. But in those performing scenes, I kind of switched to the third person. So almost imagine that you're an audience member and kind of viewing the scene. So I kind of tried to describe what was happening on stage. But that also just felt really wrong, because it's, the book is all about somebody kind of inhabiting themselves and learning to wield their voice. So suddenly kind of objectifying my character felt kind of strange in those moments. And then I realized that I think when the moments in my life when I performed and it's felt amazing, you've had that incredible buzzy performance feeling, have been those moments when you're sort of totally in the moment and in the character. And they're the times when you're not thinking about, oh, now I need to draw a breath and I need to make sure I'm engaging my support muscles and I need to breathe here and remember this consonant and whatever. It's the moments when you are thinking about those kind of emotional, the emotional color of what you're doing, and you're totally inhabiting that. So yeah, I think that's what I was trying to get across in those bits.
Well, for anybody who's watching who hasn't read it yet, I think that is part of what really shines for me about your book, was the way that you really made the character come alive. Both, I think it's very difficult to do as a writer, to be quite frank, to tell stories about performers and not have them feel like an object or sort of outside of the actual human experience of creating art. And I think that's something you absolutely nail. So for anybody who's watching now, that's a place where you really shine. So congratulations. I was just blown away by that. Like, you shine doing that. Like gold, like congratulations. I just, yeah, you do such a good job with that. I'm curious, this is a little bit of like a left-hand turn. I'm curious, when we're thinking about your book, the other piece that really stood out to me was some of the kind of themes around feminism that Anna, the main character, Anna, doesn't necessarily vibe with or quite click with, and the way that she sort of ingests them and explores them and sort of almost like holds up an object and looks at this from different angles. Can you talk to me a little bit about like how you got to that place with the novel and how you sort of worked that in? And sort of, I guess why it stands out to me is that coming of age and recognizing yourself as a female and ingesting all of the ways that other people define you or define their experience as female, and incorporating that into yourself. And I'm curious how you approached writing that.
Yeah, so my character, so she's quite young. Anna is she's quite young. She's quite impressionable. She's quite malleable, and despite the fact that she's sort of very ambitious, she's very set on this particular path. She really knows what she wants in one way. Like in another way, she's pretty confused and conflicted. And I set her against so other female characters, mostly her best friend Laurie, but also a selection of Laurie's friends who are kind of very like hard-lined feminists, and they have very, very kind of rigid views about things. And at one point in the novel, Anna ends up moving into kind of feminist experiment in women living together run by one of Laurie's friends, which I had a little bit of fun with. But I think what I was trying to explore there, I mean, so that's that selection of women who aren't Anna in the novel. They all have very kind of fixed views about things, but I also sort of wanted to explore the way that our fixed views about things are not necessarily the same as our desires or the ways that we behave. So lots of those women, despite having very strong views on things like free bleeding or pubic hair, also have very conflicting and contradictory views on casual sex, for example. So I think that despite the fact those women are very kind of vocally feminist and subscribe to a particular type of feminism, I think in some ways they're as conflicted as Anna is, just perhaps in a slightly different way, whereas Anna kind of lets herself be shaped by other people. They're perhaps stronger in some of their views, but you know, perhaps like equally, I don't know, equally confused or equally misled in some ways. So I think that's what I really wanted to explore, this idea of kind of, you know, whether or not, like, what the right way of living as a woman is now. I mean, whether, you know, whether it's kind of, I don't know, right is the right word, but whether, you know, having those kind of quite hard-lined views is the right thing, whether, you know, some of the ways that those women see the world are, you know, actually things that make them unhappy, you know, things that mean that they can't fulfill the other things that they want in their life. And with Anna, I was just really interested in creating a character who, you know, both is really driven, you know, she is a feminist. She really wants, like, her career is really, really important to her, but she also wants to have a relationship with a man, and the particular man that she chooses to have a relationship with is somebody who, you know, is older than her, is kind of more powerful than her in a number of ways, and there are kind of number of reasons why getting involved with him might not be such a good idea, and yet she goes ahead and does it anyway, and she kind of drives that relationship, quite actively. So yeah, I suppose to answer your question, I was interested in just looking at like different ways of interpreting feminism and how we should live like, as women. And I'm not sure there's necessarily a right or straightforward answer to that, but I think that all of my female characters are doing that in slightly different ways, perhaps, and in ways that make them quite angry with each other at times. But yeah, I think all of them are kind of exploring that central question of how to live as a woman, particularly when you want to be in a relationship with a man.
I'm also curious, and we touched on this just a little bit, but Anna as a very malleable kind of character. And she spends a lot of the book in communities with people who have extremely strong stances on any number of things, or very strong views or commitments to concepts that, to your point, don't always make them necessarily happy. And I'm curious, why is it that you chose to write Anna in kind of a softer way, or a way that readers might perceive as softer or more easily influenced than some of the other characters around her, as opposed to something like a very strong personality running into another strong personality?
I think that what I really was interested in showing was just that particular moment in time of being young and not really knowing who you are, and kind of taking a little bit from everyone and everything, and trying to find your path, but like fundamentally not really knowing what the right way of living is. And I think when you're so Anna's 24. I mean, she's not incredibly young, but she's young enough to not be especially kind of experienced in the world yet, and to not particularly know herself. So I think that was what I was really interested in exploring, kind of how, when you're that age, you can be really, really easily swayed by other people, and how, if you don't find your own path, if you can't kind of stay strong within yourself and find agency and push back against people, you can be really, really easily led into doing things or being somebody that you don't necessarily want to be. So yeah, I suppose maybe it's just my experience of being young, I don't know. But I think that feeling of being kind of really uncertain is quite kind of universal to being that sort of age. And I think possibly even, Laurie and her friends, who are a little bit older than Anna, but not too much older, I think a lot of their certainty is kind of posturing. I mean, at certain points in the novel, like Laurie gets very upset about things that have happened in her life that seem to totally contradict all of the things that she says, that she says she believes. So yeah, I think perhaps I've written the novel in like a very close first person, so we have access to all of Anna's feelings and thoughts. But I suspect that had I chosen to write the novel from some other women's perspectives, there might be similar things going on, actually. I think that a lot of Anna's malleability actually comes in her internal monologue, rather than necessarily the things that she says to other people. So perhaps we see her as such a kind of malleable character because we have access to all of this inner turmoil, which I think is quite a universal, experience for being young, being that age. And then particularly as she then becomes involved with somebody who has kind of authority over her in a way, Max, who is has authority over her because he's quite a lot older than her, but also because he's just he has a very different sort of life, a kind of much more settled, he's a banker, he's got a much more settled type of life. And so she finds herself being quite easily coloured by his worldview, and the way that he thinks about kind of her art, her career in particular. And again, I think that that is quite a universal thing as well. The fact that if we in those sorts of relationships with uneven power dynamics, sorts of relationships where one person has some sort of authority over the other person, it's very, very easy for the weaker party in that worldview to be coloured by the more powerful person, I think.
Yeah, to kind of get swallowed up in that person's worldview, especially when that person has life. And there's the, I think what really struck me about Anna's character, and I guess this is often a theme in romance too, but when you're young, there's knowing what you want, but not necessarily knowing who you are. And so much of the challenge of aging is sort of the inverse, like where you suddenly know exactly who you are, but not what you want. like, oh, I can tell you what I don't want to do, but what do I want to do? And that journey to becoming a little bit more sure of who you are, and the costs and trade-offs that are associated with that really stood out to me as something that was lovely and again well done in your piece. It's just that aging and that optimism, that pure optimism of being young and having a goal, and almost the goal detached from yourself. Like you know the mechanics of it, but the emotional work that it takes to make a goal happen is not as familiar, I think, when you're young.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that when you're young, you have like a very strong sense of what you want, but like not necessarily a strong sense of like what you need and how to balance the different wants that you have. So like a major idea that I wanted to explore in the novel is the fact that Anna's relationship comes into conflict with her ambition, and that in kind of giving in or pursuing this sort of slightly self-destructive, like impulsive want that she has for this man, she starts to put into jeopardy this thing that's incredibly important to her and always has been, and like kind of one thing that she really, really wants from life. So yeah, that was something else that I was really interested in looking at.
Definition of self as outside, I think, is also really common when you're young, that the thing that you do is somehow your personality, and without it, you're kind of floating in. My parents used to call it your special, right? And you needed to guard your special because it was part of what gave you a foundation until you could really come to a sense of who you were. So if you were good at sports, just guard being good at sports because you're special until you know why you're special outside of this thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting idea.
You're special. Like, this is your special.
It's true. You have something kind of concrete, don't you, to like tie your identity to until you. I mean, I think then as you get older, you sort of start to learn that your identity is not about external things like that. But yeah, when you're like in your teens, in your early 20s, like I think you are, if you like, you need things like that to anchor yourself to, and that could be a kind of career or like a talent, but I think it can also be a relationship. And I think that's a danger as well, that's quite often what we tie our identities to at that age.
Oh yeah, and I think that special sometimes isn't necessarily a thing you even chose. Kind of going back to when you look at your career and how you got there. For those of us who started young, it was the thing we were good at. People praised us for it, and so it became your special because you were good at it. But it wasn't ever the thing that actually made you special. It was just a thing you were good at.
Yeah.
And waking up one day and going, "Wait, am I just good at this, or do I love doing this?" And what it takes to step away, and like emotionally being ready to step away. I think
that's
part of what makes it. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, did you think that like was singing your special thing when you were?
Oh, for a long time, singing was my special, absolutely. And because I did it well on a regional level, then going to school with other people who had done it well on a regional level. And we knew some of each other from competitions and things like that. So you knew who was in the room. But I think my program started with 20 some odd students and ended with 12. So about half of us lost our special along the way, or stopped and asked if our special was what actually made us special. For some people, they just replaced it with relationship or other things. And for some people who realized that they wanted to be a doctor or like any number of things, they just happened to
revelation than wanting to be a singer, I have to say.
Yeah, it is a lot clearer to becoming a doctor. And that kind of like process of, oh, you're special. I think what was interesting about Anna and what resonated with me is there are kind of two ways that you square with you have to make peace with whatever the special is at a certain point. Either you keep doing it and you love it and you've made peace with it because you've examined it from all angles, or in Anna's case, that sort of almost ripping of it from you until you have to build. And that really resonated with me as sort of, I don't want to, no spoilers for those watching, but sort of Anna's bleak moment and the examining of everything, I thought was really fascinating to me, and the loss of the thing that she held most dear.
Yeah, I mean, I like something I wanted to think about there was that idea of like, yeah, not like having to really fight for the thing that you want and having to really like claim that as part, like the fact that she makes the decision to kind of claim that as part of her identity and not to let go of it. And yeah, I use, I think throughout the novel, I kind of, while this novel is about like an opera singer, I was thinking about that idea of singing as more generally just a kind of symbol or way of expressing that idea of kind of taking hold of yourself, coming into yourself, like using your voice. So like for Anna, I think I kind of struggle to like cling on to that part of her identity is also like more generally like just a struggle to like cling on to her sense of self and like not to allow herself to be totally subsumed by a relationship.
Yeah, I just thought that was in some ways almost a stand-in for a dream, and that odd sort of thing that happens when you're just adult enough to know that the world exists in some ways. I think I used to joke when I lived in LA that I lived with a level of invincibility that like this city sort of fed. Everything around you is always glittering and shining and young in its own weird way. Your reality is constantly reflected back at you on television and things like that. And as I aged, I realized that I was no longer invincible, that I didn't, that 3 o'clock in the morning kind of running around at the top of a building and then wondering if you should go to a party in Hollywood or whatever. That sort of thing was like a trade-off in my time, and that both weren't always going to be the case. And did I actually want them to be? And that was something that really I enjoyed reading reading your work and seeing that sort of like endlessness and optimism of youth, and that kind of promised long nights with weird endings, and growing through that, I think, was another thing that I just thought you did really well. There's not a question buried in there. That's just the thing that I thought you did well.
Thank you. Shall we check in to see if there are any questions?
Oh, yes. I'm glad you're paying attention. Let's see. Hi, John.
Hi. Yes, there is one question so far. And I will take this time to remind any viewers that they can submit their questions at any time, even while I'm still talking, if they have any questions for Imogen. A viewer writes, "This is such a wonderful conversation. Thank you both so much. Imogen, what was your inspiration for writing A Very Nice Girl? Did you have a clear sense of Anna and or the storyline before you started writing, or did that come more as you were writing?"
So my inspiration for writing this novel actually came from another book, which was by one of my favorite writers, Jean Rhys. It's called Voyage in the Dark, and it was written in 1934. And I was rereading this book, and I happened to be rereading it like literally, I think, a week before the Me Too movement took off, so in October 2017. And it's a book about a young chorus girl who's also called Anna, so I stole the name, and she is living in London. She's alone, she's very isolated, and she meets an older man, and kind of he sucks her out of her life basically, and starts to support her. And just reading this book, I was like really struck by the resonances between Rhys's work and the things that were hitting the headlines. I mean, this idea of this kind of older man basically like bringing a young woman out of her life because of his power, because of his money, but also just things like, I mean, Jean Rhys writes wonderfully about the kind of loneliness of the city, like the alienation of being a young person in London and kind of living in temporary rooms. So I started thinking, reading that book about like, who Anna would be in the modern day and how I could update her, how I could transplant this story into a modern setting. And that's when I thought about this kind of operatic idea, because I thought, like we were talking about earlier, the fact that being a singer is so unglamorous, even though everyone thinks it's wonderfully glamorous. So I just had this idea of, a student living a studenty lifestyle in like kind of millennial contemporary London, living in temporary rooms, struggling to get by, and then meeting a man who's kind of totally in a different world to her, and the impact that that has on her career. In terms of like how much of the plot I had sorted out, I had a few of the very key things. Again, don't want to give any spoilers, but I had a sense of the kind of general trajectory of what would happen when Max entered Anna's life and the impact that would have on her career. And that never changed, from that initial conception. But everything else I sort of figured out along the way. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess I have a question as well. And if I may, I think there's a lot of, in my industry, in the book selling world, you encounter a lot of what people in publishing sales call comps, like titles they want to compare your title to sell your title. And I think comparisons can diminish both parties in a way, I think sometimes, but it's curious to see and interesting to see this novel placed alongside other contemporary literary novels about people writing about other people their own age, as if that's new in literature. But it's often sort of has this bleed over with perhaps like autofiction and things like that. And obviously you're drawing from your experiences in the conservatory as well. And I'm not so much interested in how, how readers disambiguate authors from characters. But for you, I mean, it's so fascinating to hear you talk about Jean Rhys as an inspiration and updating that novel as if other novels that seem to be autofiction or seem to take, experience that the author has from, say, working in the restaurant industry or being a young person in London or New York City or something like that. But I'm interested in how you disambiguate for yourself, like what you are going to take from an experience to fictionalize or to lend real sort of authority or realism to your story, and what you keep, I guess. Like, how do you keep the world separate when you're creating a fictionalized world that characters will inhabit, but it is so deeply rooted in your experience of that world and also themes and questions you want to explore? As a standpoint of someone who went to school to write poetry, I'm always infuriated by how fiction writers can figure this thing out. And so I'm always curious to know, like, how that equation is solved for them.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not totally sure I know how to answer it. But what I would say is, I suppose, so in my novel, I suppose the things that I took from my real life are, I used my knowledge of the singing world and the kind of details of that. And I suppose I've used kind of my psychology to color the thoughts and feelings of my character. I don't know how else you write. I guess maybe as I get more experienced at writing, I'll be able to think of a different way of doing it. But currently, I use thoughts and feelings that I've had, even though I'm kind of transplanting that into a totally different context. I guess the way that I disambiguate that from my real life is that the plot is totally removed from something that's ever happened to me. So there are no real parallels between Anna and her relationship with Max and how that plays into the singing world and my life. So I see her as totally separate to me. She is quite a bit younger than me, actually. She does feel separate to me as a character. And I think that as I carried on writing the book, and when I went back to edit it, there were quite nice moments in reading it where I suddenly thought, oh, she wouldn't actually say that, or she wouldn't actually think that. And I think I could do that because I'd like achieved sort of separation from her. It almost felt like a different person to me than I did, than I was. But I think that is, you know, like because the plot's different to anything that's happened to me, because she is a little bit younger than me, and because I kind of I suppose I was probably channeling more of how I might have felt at that age and imagining that as well, which naturally gives you a degree of separation from the character as well. I think probably when I started writing the book, and I was obviously a bit younger than then, I was closer to her, and then as I carried on writing it and carried on developing it and got older as I was writing it, I became more separate from her, I suppose.
That makes sense. Yeah, thank you. I was worried asking a question that doesn't make any sense to begin with. But and is it the same for you? I mean, when you write into, you know, a form or like a genre, I feel like there's this perception that you are, you know, excused from having to worry about these things, which I think, especially if you're writing romance, like certainly not. Like you one only understands romance through experience. So is it the same for you, where you feel a point? Because the thing that Imogen is describing is so fascinating to me, that there's like a moment where like amoeba splitting, like the character is a separate, like you achieve this sort of separation from whatever sort of like psychological knowledge you're imparting for them to become their own character. So there's a moment in the drafting process for you two where you feel like, okay, now I know what the separate individual, what their motivations are, how they would behave in certain situations and things like that.
Yeah, some of it is similar. I often think that what I take as observations, like that's what shows up in my writing more than anything, is what I tend to think about other people. For example, I had an ex-boyfriend whose personality was basically a suit. Like that was, his personality was a suit. Like that kind of thing, you can write that into a character because everyone knows exactly what you mean when you say his personality was a gray suit. Like, you know what that is? It's a gray attempt at purchasing class. So that kind of stuff I take. I also joke that a first draft is for a writer, that final draft is for a reader. So how I feel or think after that first draft, it's me filing off the serial numbers. It's me polishing and creating a character who is independent and different from me. In genre fiction, I always like to suggest pull the tarot or use Zodiac as to create characters, kind of thing, because those are personality archetypes, just like so I always make sure that whoever I'm writing is not an Aquarius, because then you're still writing yourself. So if I'm writing Virgo or something else, good news. Like Pisces, all right, it's somebody else. But I do think, particularly with readers, they, in genre fiction, they will ask you, is this, like, who is this based on? Is this your life? And so you do want to file off the serial numbers, or people will be combing through your history looking for that bad boyfriend. So also warning to bad boyfriends. I will kill you off in a novel. And it'll be obvious.
Imogen, do you feel the sense then in drafting that you are, this is just like me doing my own research. I'm sorry. This is becoming that. But I'm just like, do you feel that sense of, for a character like Max, or someone who, you know, it's like, how do you familiarize? I guess you have to familiarize yourself with motivations that are not your own. And how does one do that, like whole cloth, I guess? I mean, I suppose that's part of just the magic of drafting, as Addie is saying, is that you'll have those serial numbers, and then you just are starting to sort of release the figure from the marble, I think is what this great sculptor used to say.
I mean, Max was an interesting one, because when I first started writing the novel, my conception of Max was far more 2D than I hope it's ended up. And I like really did just see him as a sort of bad man character. And I did quite a lot of work on, I developed quite an extensive backstory for him, which isn't in the novel, but it was something that I was aware of. So I kind of came up with his whole history up to the point where he meets Anna, which I then kind of explains to me his motivation for behaving in the way that he does, even though I don't make that clear to the reader, like explicitly clear to the reader, because I mean, I think one trick in my novel is that like it's so closely first person that Anna doesn't totally understand him, and I really did want to have that kind of very limited perspective that she has on him. Of course, I needed to understand him so that there's enough in him that the reader can imagine his life behind him. But I also wanted to, show her very skewed, warped, limited perspective on him as a character. But yeah, with him, it was backstory, observation as well, like Addie says, and talking to lots of friends about their awful relationships.
Thank you. We're reaching the top of the hour. If I may just ask one more, hopefully not too annoying, bookseller question. We're always really curious to, obviously we are in the trade to recommend books to people, but we always like to know what authors are reading as well. So in addition to picking up both of your books, what are you reading, maybe currently enjoying, that you might like to suggest to our viewers? Maybe even other media or wine.
Let's see. So nonfiction, Fearing the Black Body by Dr. Sabrina Strings. It traces the history and origins of fat phobia. Super good, highly recommend. So that's nonfiction. Fiction, I am reading, I just finished Digging Up Love by Chandra Blumberg. She's a debut author, and it has paleontology and baking, and it's a romance, and it's darling. So if you are looking for something that will make you feel like there's light in the world, I recommend that one. If you would like something that makes you feel like what is wrong with the world, Fearing the Black Body. I've got you covered.
I'm reading at the moment, I'm reading two things simultaneously. I'm reading a collection of short stories by Mary Gaitskell called Because They Wanted To, which I hadn't actually read before. I love bad behavior. But yeah, I hadn't read this collection, and it's incredible, and it's just the most wonderful portraits of complicated, messy relationships. So that's fantastic. If you like messy, strange power dynamics between men and women, that's the thing to go for. I'm also reading Ishiguro's The Unconsoled, which is about a pianist who turns up at a European city and can't remember what concert he's offered to give. It's very, very strange, this sort of mad, dreamlike world. Totally unlike anything I've ever read before, and it's rather brilliant, I think.
Thank you both. Those are wonderful suggestions. Imogen Crimp, Addie Woolridge, thank you so much for joining us at Home with Literati. Very early this morning, in Imogen's case, and earlier this afternoon as well in California. We hope to have you both in the bookstore in the not too distant future, but we hope you continue to stay safe and be well until then. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. Have a great night, everybody. Take care.